We've got a fun episode for everyone today, a break from our typical business and marketing and sort of social media psychology stuff, and we're going to have a little fun. Today's topic is things that were considered normal when I was a kid that are totally bizarre today. Let's go down memory lane together and have some fun.
The show is about to start in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
This is Don't Fear Grit with Rob Taormina. Marketing strategies and advertising technologies to help you build a better business.
So this is definitely a fun topic and something that I have thought about. And it's definitely something that when you're with your friends and family and whatnot, it comes up and it's one of those sort of roundtable discussions. But it's things that you did as a kid that you don't do now, or your kids don't do now, or are completely bizarre now, but were normal when you were a kid. And that list is definitely growing and growing and growing as we get older and older and older. And it's just really interesting. And I was recently having this conversation and we were going down memory lane and I'm like, oh, what a great episode for the next podcast show. Let's do it. Let's take a little bit of a break from our normal scheduled programming and just have some fun. And let's get a little creative here so that we can all reminisce together on some of the cool things and some of the bizarre things that we did as a kid. So we'll start off with some easy stuff, and then along the way, I got some things on this list that is going to make you go, huh, that's interesting. Well, the first one is that when I was a kid and you picked up the phone, you had no idea who was calling. There was no such thing as caller ID, which means if the phone rang, you picked up the phone. And it was always, you have no idea who's going to be on the other end. Is it someone calling for your parents? Is it a neighbor? Is it a boy or girl calling from school that you're going to be nervous about? You have no idea. So that sort of like excitement built up until you heard the person's name on the other side of the line, and you would say, "Hey, hello, who is this?" And so that's the first one. Is again, there was no such thing as caller ID when I was a kid, so I just remember as a kid, the phone rang, and I was. If I like there was someone I wanted to speak to, I was always anticipating, like I would say, like, oh, I hope it's this person calling, and always, well, not always, but more often than not, being disappointed because the calls were more often than not were not for me, actually, because of course I'm a kid, right? But on the topic of phones, also another big thing is if you are on a phone call, ready for this? You had to stay within a 6-foot radius of the phone because everything was corded. There were no wireless phones, right? Like everyone has a cell phone now. You can make a phone call from anywhere, right? But back then it was only landlines, and you were connected with this cord that pretty much stayed raveled up and all disheveled and knotted. Oh my God. I don't know how many times I tried to unravel that cord growing up. But yeah, the one big thing is always having to stay within a 6-foot radius of that phone. So there were no private conversations, and unless you like were able to get like one of those long cables, and you were able to like pull actually the whole phone with you, like in a closet or into your room, and you had this long cable going through your house. And then, game changer when you had the wireless landlines in the house. Oh, that was a big deal as well. But that was another big thing, is remember the cords. But the big thing about the cords, I'm always, for some reason, they never stayed untangled. I don't know about you guys. Were your cords always tangled? Because even though they had that spiral thing would always get tangled up. And it's because you had to stay within that 6-foot radius, and you were just like walking in circles with it, pretty bizarre stuff. Another thing that I remember even when I first started driving, and not that I'm that old, but I'm a sort of unique age where I experience analog and digital. Right, where I'm old enough where I had the analog, young enough where digital was part of the transition as well. But when I first started driving, paper maps were still the way to travel. There was no technology that you could plug in navigation. There was no GPS like that. So it was all paper maps. And I remember that's roughly when like MapQuest, you can go to MapQuest.com and you could print out, even though you can go digitally to get directions, you had to still print it out. And but before I get to that, I remember vividly when I was a kid having these big maps that would be folded perfectly into like a brochure size. And I remember like we would stop at like rest stops and get the local paper map and this massive thing. I'm talking about huge, like the size of the table here. And you have this map and you have to try to find, okay, we are here, we have to go there, and just navigate through this map. You know what's interesting is that we all did it and everyone knew how to do it, even as a kid. Like, it was just part of life, really. It was like this assumed process. Everyone knew how to read a map and get from point A to point B. And then I remember when we transitioned to MapQuest and everyone would print out all these directions, is what you initially had to do if you were going a long distance, you would print out like 6 different variations. You'd be from point A to point B, from point B back to point A. Oh, what if you detoured? Like, you would have all of these different variations just in case, because you weren't going to get to a computer at the hotel. You didn't have that. You didn't have printers. You would have this massive folder, I remember, of all these directions. And oh man, I remember the car littered with just directions if you were going on a long trip. But yeah, paper maps, I remember that vividly, and I loved that as a kid, going to the rest stops and getting the local paper map and just unfolding this glorious thing. Be like, oh my God, the world is so big. It was pretty cool. Another thing is that I remember as a kid. Now, depending on where you are in the world, this is still sort of commonplace, but around here it's not now. But when I was a kid, there were a lot of dogs and cats that simply just roamed the streets. It was normal to have an outdoor cat, normal to have an outdoor dog, and they sort of roamed rampant. I remember vividly seeing this. In fact, I remember when I was a kid, I must have been in maybe like 3rd grade, my teacher asked us, instructed us, we have to write our own creative story. Come up with your own story, your own characters, and write a whole thing. And there was someone that I knew that had a dog that was an outdoor dog and it just roamed, right? And I remember oftentimes this person would like babysit me, but I would go to their house, and sometimes I would play the dog if it was there, and if it wasn't, they would be like, oh no, the dog's not here, it's roaming around. And I remember thinking like, oh, what is the dog doing? So as a kid, I remember vividly, I wrote a story about where this dog went. I love this. This meant so much to me that I still remember it to this day. But again, I wrote a story because it was commonplace back then. They were just dogs and cats that just sort of roamed free and did their thing. And I guess, many lawsuits later of kids getting hurt and bit by random dogs, that is definitely a thing of the past. Locally, you don't see random dogs. If you see a dog, you know there's something wrong roaming randomly around. Maybe there's a few stray cats here and there, but not like it used to be. I remember as a kid there being dogs and cats everywhere. It was just sort of commonplace. Another big thing that I remember that was very normal when I was a kid, that is definitely not normal now, oh my gosh, absolutely not, is that how unsupervised we were as kids. And I've told this story many, many times, and like, it's like a shocking thing to have this discussion now, but when I was a kid, when I was 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, I would regularly be by myself. I would take my bike. I would bike to the next town over by myself to my friend's house, play wiffle ball in the streets. It would get dark and they'd be like, oh, it's time to go home. So I would take my bike back home by myself, do my thing. And we're talking about as a 6 to 9 year old taking his bicycle between towns, main roads, side streets. It was commonplace. And it's not like people would see me and be like, oh my gosh, let's help this kid out, he's lost. No, because all of us kids did that. So it's not like the neighbors or adults would be weirded out by seeing that and call the police. Not at all. That was commonplace back then. Fast forward to now, you see a child by himself, you think parental neglect, call 911, I'm going to stay with the kid. And rightfully so, because culturally it's changed. It's not as safe maybe now, and there's a lot of other variables involved, but I couldn't imagine even allowing my kids now, who are 13 years old, taking their bike by themselves to the next town over to their friends. I would never. They'd be grounded, my gosh, for the next 40 years if they ever did that. And nor would they ever even think to do that. You don't see kids by themselves anymore, really unsupervised. Now, if you see it, you definitely put it in that category of there's something wrong. Either it's suspicious on their part, like, oh, what are these kids up to? or these kids are by themselves and they're being unsupervised. Again, we're not that far off as far as when I was a kid versus now, but that's been a huge cultural shift. Is back then kids were not supervised. Now they absolutely are supervised a whole lot more. Another big thing that I remember, even when I became a teenager, the Yellow Pages was like your ticket to understanding what was in the community. If you didn't have the Yellow Pages, you were lost. You didn't know that there was a world that existed outside of the media of your little neighborhood, and you relied on it for everything. You relied on it not just adults, for like the plumber, the electrician. You relied on it for the local pizzeria. I remember the local Yellow Pages would put out a special. There was a pizzeria, Mama Teresa's. They would put out a special, and it was for $5.99. You can get a whole pie, and my friends and I would like rip this out, and we would call Mama Teresa's to get our $5.99 pie. But we relied on the phone book, and we all knew how to use a phone book. Every household had a phone book. Like if you didn't have a phone book, you were lost. The Yellow Pages. That was huge. The Yellow Pages were huge. It was the Yellow Pages and the White Pages, and if you didn't have those, my gosh, you were lost. Kids these days, they don't even know what that is, but that was basically the Google of the day. Again, you didn't have your Yellow Pages, you definitely were absolutely lost. Another thing that I remember as a kid, I remember if like going to the hospital, and like I could close my eyes and I could see the lobby in the waiting room and people smoking, which is bizarre. We're talking about a hospital here. So that's a bizarre thing to think about. But I do have memories of going to the hospital and people in there just commonplace smoking. It was a very common thing. Just like, there was smoking on airplanes. Now, oh my God, it's like a federal offense to do that stuff. So that's another big thing. That's a big difference between then and now. Let's see here. I got some things written down. Oh my gosh, the payphone. I think I just recently read that there's like one active live working payphone left in New York State or something like that. Some like crazy stat. But because there's no cell phones, everyone always would leave with at least a quarter. And and then you date yourself back even earlier than me, I think it was a dime. But for me growing up, it was a quarter. You always have, if you left, you always had to have a quarter in your pocket. This way you can always call home. You can call your mom or dad or whatever. And there are payphones everywhere. There was literally payphones everywhere. There were payphones in street corners. There were payphones in buildings. There were just payphones everywhere to allow you to connect. With your family that way. There was payphones in schools. I remember actually there was a payphone right outside the administrative office of my school. There was one, and that thing got a whole lot of use. That's how you called home for various things. And then later on, when collect call was introduced, then we figured out a workaround, because they asked you to record like your name. And so what you would do is like you would put like your message in the name, and this way you didn't need a quarter necessarily, and then they can hear the message. Or if the caller on the other side accepted it, then the person who was on the other side had to then pay the charges for that. But yeah, I remember payphones were a huge part of being a teenager, because that was the one thing, like I had to check in with my parents, be like, you're going whatever, like make sure you call, here's your quarter, whatever. So payphones were definitely a big part of it. Let's see here. I'm just going through my list. Oh, another big thing. I remember, not me, but I remember like all the girls like in my class or in the neighborhood. Like it was like a rite of passage. Once you turned like 12 or 13, you got a babysitting job. Like if you were 13 and you were a girl, you got a job and you were a babysitter. And they thought that immediately you were prepared to go from like elementary school child, you turn 13, well now you could babysit six children, one infant still in diapers, and do homework. Like it was just a common thing. Like you matured very quickly if you were 13 and a girl, because boom, you had that responsibility, and you know what, you got paid for it. But it's amazing to think that they thought that 13-year-olds had the maturity level to be able to handle that. But, honestly, they did in many cases. So it's interesting how we've gotten away from that. Like how many 13-year-old girls now are babysitting as a job. You could probably count them maybe on one hand of everyone that you know. Back then, if you were 13, it was like a done deal. 100% of you were babysitters. Like that was your job, you know. I remember that vividly. I remember being a little bit jealous because they were like having all this cash. I'm like, I want cash, you know. This wasn't me, but I remember my grandparents though telling me this, is that they had their milk delivered in these glass bottles, and then there was a milkman who would come and you would leave the empties out, and he would just sort of like recycle it and give you the new ones in this like this little metal sort of basket with these glass bottles. And that's how you would get your fresh milk delivery. Another thing that I saw online also is that, and this is true, like if I see like pictures of like my mom and my aunts when they were little kids and like playing in the snow, girls were in skirts with high knee socks and boys were in pants. And I'm like, that's not right. Like it's freezing out and you're making girls wear these little skirts with high knee socks. It's crazy. Oh my gosh. This is a big one. And I think I'm going to end the episode on this one. Is that I remember a photography. If you were going to take a picture, you made sure you were taking the picture that you actually wanted, because it was expensive. You know, you had these expensive cameras. You had to put in rolls of film every single time. And I think it was 24 or 36. And then you had to take it to a place, give them that roll of film. They would develop it. It would take like a week. And then you just cross your fingers that you got a good picture because you were paying for it regardless. And it was not cheap. So it was time consuming. It was expensive. So, you know, that's why, like, if, again, people weren't taking thousands of pictures like you do now, because you listen, you got your cell phone. You could take a zillion of them, right? And there's no expense to you for doing that. Back then, there was a huge expense. So you really thought long and hard if you were going to, in fact, take that picture, which is why, you know, you don't have, you know, events as of a kid and thousands of pictures. You'll have like 2 or 3 pictures of your birthday because, again, it was expensive to do that back then. It was time consuming. Like, could you imagine dropping off a roll of film, not knowing if you actually did it right? Paying all this money to go back a week later at the event, and then you find, oh my gosh, they're all white. Oh my gosh, it's blurry. Oh my gosh, my finger was in front of it. Like, that happened. And but yeah, I remember the disposable cameras. That helped a little bit, helped with the cost, but still you would get a disposable camera where you had 24 pictures. I remember going on my class trip, and I had my disposable camera that my parents gave me. And those 24 pictures had to last the entire trip. So in moments, you would wind it up. You have to crank it up, right? And then you have to charge the flash. You hold this little button, you charge the flash. And then you would sit there and you'd be like, is this worth it? Should I take the picture? You know, like you really thought about, like, do I want to waste one of my 24 pictures on this? But yeah, I do remember that vividly, and having rolls and rolls of film. And, you know, and I have no doubt that if I go through like my junk bags that I have in my storage, whatever, I can probably still find 1 or 2 rolls of film that are still not developed. And because here's the thing, you didn't develop a roll of film until you finished every picture. So it's not like you had a roll of film of 24 and you only took like 18 and you developed that. No way. You're not wasting that. So what would you do? You would just save it until the next event you would have. And so sometimes it could take months to actually develop a roll of film because you waited until it was finished. So that's why I have no doubt I probably have a roll or 2 somewhere from when I was a kid that's not developed, and some probably gold mine of a great moment that that maybe I should try to do that. I don't even know where to develop film though these days. I'm sure you can probably do that. But you know what? Actually, I want to end on one more thing. Is I remember as a kid, now the cars were made a little bit differently in the sense that now you have these rules and regulations that govern, you know, where a child can sit, how they can sit, in what they can sit, seatbelts and all that stuff. They didn't have that when I was a kid. So if you were the older kid, you would be on the floor if there wasn't an available seat, and so that the youngest could be like, you know, secured properly. So I would sit on the floor as the oldest kid. And I remember there were actually cars, station wagons, where you had the last row actually faced the opposite way. I loved that seat. So if I can grab that seat, and like one of my friends' parents had that, I remember I'd be like, oh, can I please sit in the back? And like people would fight over it because that was a cool seat. You get to see the back. No seatbelts though. It was like a free for all. And it was like a jungle gym in a way. But yeah, I remember the cars were just different as far as the rules for kids. And seatbelts and roaming around and having those seats that face backwards. Like, it was just bizarre. So listen, this list goes on and on and on. I've had so many of these really great conversations with friends and family, and I want to encourage you to do that one day, is get down with some friends, maybe a couple cocktails, whatever, and just having a fun night of thinking, what was something that was normal when you were a kid that's totally bizarre now? And I bet you guys are going to come up with some really, really cool answers. I'd love to hear them. Message me. I love actually this particular topic. It really gets me to reminisce. It's funny, I'm getting to the age where it's like, oh, the good old days, but no, it's true. And I love this. So this is a fun conversation. I hope you guys enjoyed this particular topic as much as I did. Definitely take a listen. Go back and share this with some friends and be like, hey, remember this? Because I guarantee you they're going to enjoy reminiscing and bringing back all those fun memories as well. All right, guys, until next time, remember, don't fear the process and don't fear grit. We'll see you next time. Take care.